And my CVP colleagues, I've made a couple of you co-hosts. If I miss anyone coming in, please let them in. And I did put a prompt in the chat. If you could share your name, your campus, or your org, your pronouns, and just one word to describe how you're currently feeling. And that can be about the election, the seasons, the weather, anything. So today, the Voter Friendly Campus webinar, we're focused on really reflecting on the election. And I know a lot of people have a lot of feelings, but I do want to center that this is a nonpartisan space. So today we're just going to really focus on how people are feeling on their campuses, how we can provide support, really where do we go from here? But before we open up that discussion, we have a wonderful guest speaker, Abby, from Circle, who she's just going to walk us through a presentation about the numbers and the data that they have seen. So, Abby, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for putting your thoughts and things about you in the chat. I really appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? See some thumbs up? Okay, thank you. All right, great. Thank you both very much. So I guess a little bit of background. My name is Abby Kisa, use she, her pronouns, and I am Deputy Director at Circle. And that Circle is part of the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, which is a whole college on the Tufts campus focused on civic engagement. And we're focused on civic engagement at the student level across all of the different colleges, including professional schools at Tufts, as well as we have a number of research units. And Circle is one of the research units that focuses on youth civic engagement in the United States. And our particular focus is on doing research, often with communities and partners, that can help to illuminate how to close systemic inequities in young people's access and support to participate in democracy and civic life. Circle's been around since 2001, and I'm thrilled to be here and learn with you today. I have a presentation, but before I start, I guess I just wanted to build off of what our friend Chuck was saying about there's a lot that people are feeling and thinking about the election. And I want to acknowledge that up front that, you know, we all have different experiences and are coming from different perspectives and communities. And I want to acknowledge that I'm about to present some data, and it's okay to not feel cool talking about data yet, right? Like, so there's a lot that people are talking about that has nothing to do with data, or has nothing to do with you know, thinking about professional life. So I guess I just wanted to put out there that I'm about to present some data. It's okay to have critical questions of it, and it's okay to not be here for talking about data. I'm going to try to go quickly, and just want to thank you all for your work before we get this going. Your work is so critically important. Okay, so I am going to share. So the first thing that I want to say, actually, I have to do this the other way around. The first thing that I'm going to say is that we have some data right now, but we don't have all the data that would really help us and help us understand what happened or what could possibly happen. So I'm going to present a sliver of the data that we have, which is not all of the data that we would want to have in this moment. So I can't answer all the questions. This is a little bit of background about Circle. All of the data that I'm going to talk about today is online on our website, which is circle.tufts.edu. And I'm really interested, as you can see here from this infinity sign, we're all, we do our research in order to support folks like you and others who are working in the front lines with young people, to really shift institutions to support more and more young people. So here are some of the examples of the things I'm going to talk about today. We have an early estimate of youth participation and turnout. Thank you, Chuck, for putting that in the chat. We have just a little bit of insight into the 2024 youth electorate compared to the 2020 youth electorate. We have some basic questions about youth and the issues. And we have a whole lot of information on who youth voted for. But I also want to suggest some other things that we can pay attention to at the moment other than data, since data isn't the end all be all. The one thing that I do want to flag is that unless otherwise stated, the data that I'm presenting is about 18 to 29-year-olds. And in all of our work, we focus on different sort of subsections of youth. And this might not be ideal for some people. Unfortunately, it's the way that we access the data post-election. On that note, there's a couple of different types of data that I'm going to present about. One is our turnout data, and I'll explain the various sources that comes from. A lot of the data is going to come from an election week survey called AP Votecast. And this is a survey of tens of thousands, actually over 100,000 people in the United States, both voters and non-voters. I'm going to report on the young voters. And it's very rigorous in the sense that it is really trying to understand who voted, how did they vote, and get accurate information about that. The sample size for 18 to 29-year-olds is well over 10,000 young people in the United States. So it's one of the larger election-related surveys. So here we go. First, I guess I just want to pause and think a little bit about what might be helpful to know after an election, right? And I have 3 columns here. We're going to talk a lot about the 3rd column. We're not going to talk as much about the 1st and the 2nd column, the left and the middle column, because we don't have the data yet. But I want to acknowledge that all of these things are incredibly important, and there's probably other things that you're thinking about with respect to your local situation. And feel free to put other things that you're paying attention to in the chat via, if they're data, that's great. If they're not data, maybe they're stories from students or stories from community members, that's great too. But what's something else that you're paying attention to post-election in the context of your work related to voting? Challenges students had at the poll. Yep, always have the Fair Elections Center around thinking about those things. What else are and trends in the challenges that students had at the polls are really important to understand. What else are people paying attention to post-election? Apathy, definitely. Understanding the vibes of what's happening with your students and community for sure. Yeah, this is a time for a lot of feelings, right? And analysis, and people are at different places. So we have to acknowledge those things. Yeah, and Sam is okay. I don't know if you're pronouncing your name right, but Syria. But I really appreciate the balance that you're trying to bring to this.
Sure, no, it goes both. It swings the pendulum. Hope,
Yeah.
doom, hope, doom. So
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, there's a lot to pay attention to. A lot to pay attention to. We're going to talk about a sliver of it today. But we're all in this together and we have so much opportunity as a community to learn about this. Yeah. What worked in your context, what was helpful. These are all amazing things that, the voter-friendly campus process can help people address. Okay, so I'm gonna jump in a little bit. Okay, so this very busy slide, you might want to push your laptop away from you for a second to understand, take it all in. So when we talk about youth voter turnout, we are looking at a numerator, a top number of the number of young people who cast ballots in the 2024 election, and the denominator of a citizen voting age population. So this is the percent of young citizens 18 to 29 in the United States who cast a ballot in 2024. So on the left, you can see that this is our estimate. This is our early estimate. We will replace this estimate with a final estimate in the spring. So this is just an early estimate of 42% plus or minus 1 percentage point margin of error of 18 to 29-year-olds who cast a ballot in 2024. Some people define turnout as the number of you turned out divided by the number of young people who are registered to vote. This is not that. That number would have been much higher. So this is the percentage of young people in the United States who are citizens who turned out to vote. And as you can see below it, this number is basically pretty similar to what we saw in the 2016 election using the same source of data, but lower than the 2020 election. I'm gonna go in a little bit about why we think it's lower. A lot of it has to do with access. The second thing on the slide on the right here is 50%. And that is an early estimate of young people's turnout in battleground states. And compared to 2020, as you can see underneath, it's pretty similar. So why might that be the case? Anyone have any thoughts on why young people might turn out more in a battleground state? I mean, significantly more, 8 points. Feel free to throw it in the chat or unmute yourself. Maybe you're in a battleground state and you can see why. I know that we saw some Wisconsin folks on here. Feel like your vote matters. Voting where it counted. Yep. Another thing, if we think about inputs, there's a lot more people talking about the election. There's a lot more people doing that outreach. Yeah, Amanda, more information. In our work at Circle, we talk about 3 things that are critically important to grow voters. And that as access, support, and culture. And when you have a battleground state, all of those things aren't necessarily attended to, and certainly not for all young people. But there's certainly a lot more access to information, right? Caleb, you're totally right. There's more money, so there's more people, there's more canvassing, there's a lot more in conversation as a result of that. So those are a handful of reasons why we usually see higher turnout in battleground states. So, but why did we see turnout go down? Now, we will understand a lot more about this after we do our post-election youth survey, which is in the field right now, and after we get more turnout information back, because we can't disaggregate this data amongst young people yet. We can't say, well, Latino youth voted at this rate. We can't do that yet, but we will be able to do that by the spring. But some of the reasons why we think youth turnout dropped. One is before the election, we saw pretty different, sometimes drastically different levels of young people saying that they were extremely likely to vote in 2024. Now, when we usually see some pretty big differences amongst young people, but some of these are real significant, right? And so that really raises the question of, were there issues with access and support for young people to vote in this election compared to 2020? The other thing that we saw pre-election is, compared to the 2020 election, there were fewer young people in many states registered to vote than in the 2020 election. So what is this graph? So this is for 18 to 29-year-olds. And the middle line would indicate a state being in the middle of the line would indicate that they were the same as 2020 in terms of the number of 18 to 29-year-olds registered to vote. If you're in the purple, you had more youth registered to vote in late October 2024 compared to election day 2020. And if you're in the green below, you had fewer. And you can see the sort of percentages fewer. So there was a handful of states that were doing amazing things this year compared to 2020, and some states that were struggling. Now, 2020 was a high watermark year for youth voter turnout and youth registration. So it was going to be hard to beat 2020, especially with the amount of investment that went into youth accessing elections during the pandemic, right? And lots of states got real close to 2020, right? But there's some states that were definitely not that close. So one indicator, in addition to the differences amongst young people, is this voter registration piece. And I also want to point out, and this voter registration piece, this comes from voter files. If y'all are working on data on a college campus, you probably know what a voter file is, but just humor me for a second in case in case someone isn't familiar. A voter file is the data that, right, like a county who runs the election is keeping of the people who are registered to vote. And that database does not include which candidates those people voted for, but it would include, right, all the relevant information that they need, like address. And then that gets aggregated at the state level, and then we access it through a company that aggregates all of the state data. So another thing I want to point out, so this is similar data. This is voter registration data, but it's for 18 to 19-year-olds. And you can see that there are more purple states, which is really exciting. But there's also some states in the green that are further below where the 18 to 29 was. Like I'm looking at Texas at negative 29%. The states with the slashes through them, the stripes, means that as of late October, we didn't have the most up-to-date data. So the data hadn't been updated since the middle of September, since NVRD. So there's a bunch more to do to bring in those 18 to 19-year-olds, both on campuses and off campuses, as we look at 2020 compared to 2024. So that's a little bit about what we saw in terms of participation in the 2024 election. Now, a little bit about the electorate and the makeup of the electorate. With the data that we have now, one of the big differences that we saw between the 2020 youth electorate and the 2024 youth electorate is that more young people who identified as Republican showed up in 2024 compared to 2020. And as you can see here, sometimes this differs quite a bit by gender and race. So more young men who identified as Republican turned out in 2024 compared to 2020, for example. We're also looking at some of this data by ideology, and as well as kind of other youth subgroups, but this is the most pronounced difference. And this is one of the reasons why we're talking about the fact that we really feel like we saw a different youth electorate in 2024 compared to 2020. Okay, and again, this data is from our analysis of the AP VoteCast. giant election week survey that they did of voters. And they reach people who voted in person, voted absentee, voted in person early. So it reaches a range of voters who decide to cast their ballots in different ways. Okay, so moving on. When we talk about young people, one of the things we've learned over the years is that, I think you may have had this experience that young people are much less likely to be tied to a party than they are to an issue or to a community they really want to have a positive impact on. And so issues tend to be really significant in our research and our conversations with young people about why someone would cast a ballot. So we're always looking at this issue data. This is issue data from this AP VoteCast server that I was talking about. And you can see the blue line is young voters. So again, that's 18 to 29-year-olds. And the green line is all people over 18 who voted. They're 18 and over who voted. And you can see here that the economy and jobs is the highest for both age groups. And there's some small differences between young people and older folks. And the giant one is around immigration. Now, one of the drawbacks to data like this is that it's sort of maybe one-dimensional, right? In our experience, there's a whole lot of young people who are seeing connections between issues, right? This doesn't tell you about someone's worldview. This doesn't tell you about, the ways in which someone might see racism as directly tied to the economy and jobs, or abortion tied to the economy. So it is one indicator, but it's not the end all be all indicator, right? One of the things that we have seen amongst young people is that for those young people who voted for President-elect Trump, the issue priorities were pretty different than the issue priorities for those people who voted for Vice President Harris. The top issue was still the economy and jobs, but young people who voted for Vice President Harris, there was much more spread out. There were more issue priorities. But for young people who voted for President-elect Trump, the economy and jobs was above 50%, and immigration was the next one. Which is, some indication that those two issues for some folks may be tied together, or that's part of kind of the worldview that folks were supporting. So that's some of the data we have about what motivated young people to cast ballots. Again, it's limited right now. This is on our website. We have a little bit more about issues on our website, which I, again, as Chuck put in the chat, circle@tufts.edu. A little bit more about the issue data. This graph shows amongst the young people who voted who said this was their top priority, how they cast ballots in the presidential election. Now, I'm talking about the presidential election here, and I'm going to talk about the House election next. But one of the things I want to make abundantly clear is that all elections are important, right? So I'm not trying to share this data to make the argument that, presidential elections are more important than your city council, right? Or your county council. This is the data that we have right now, right? So this is another example of the type of limits that we have on data right after the election. So as you can see here, the young people who were voting for immigration the most predominantly voted for Donald Trump. Whereas if we look at climate change, right, at the very bottom, the young people who said climate change was my most important issue were much, much, much more likely to vote for Vice President Harris. So you can see that some of these issues split a little bit, and on most of the issues, there were, pretty big differences. Okay, so let's pause for a second here. What were the issues you were hearing from students about before the election? What were the issues that you heard when you were doing your voting work that you think that the students who you were working with were thinking about pre-election? Reproductive health. Got it. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charlotte. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So different issues, certainly not all the same, right? And could differ a lot by community and what state people are in, especially if you're in a state where there was a ballot measure where reproductive rights were on the ballot. I live in Maryland and there was one there. Yeah, access to healthcare is incredibly important. So people are thinking about a lot of different issues when they go into an election and, their experiences and, who's in their family and what their community is like can impact that. Okay. So I'm going to start to, whoops, I'm going backwards. Sorry about that. I'm going to start to jump into the data about who young people voted for. And I want to emphasize that this is national data. And we do have some state data on our website, which you can go and look at. It is only state data about how young people voted for president in your state. And again, this is because of the limits that we have on what reliable data we have available at this point after the election. But I point that out because some things can be so different by state, right? And there's so many reasons why that's the case, including um, including the supports that young people have, the information that people have access to, right? What the culture of a state is like. There's so many reasons why it can differ. Excuse me. So I just want to keep that in mind as we look at this national data. So the first thing that I want to point out here, and these donuts each represent an age group. And the blue represents the percent of that age group who voted for Vice President Harris, and the red, the percent who voted for Donald Trump, and purple for another candidate. And as you can see here, while young people do have the largest percent support for Vice President Harris, it's not dramatic. So 52% for Vice President Harris and 46% for President-elect Trump. This is pretty different than 2020, and I'm going to show you on the next slide how this differs from 2020. This is graphing presidential vote choice in 2020 versus 2024. And as you can see, not only did the support amongst 18 to 29-year-olds, and again, this data is from the AP VoteCast survey, there's a decline in support for Democratic candidates and increased support for President Trump. Another thing that I can report out on is the party that they voted for in their House race, right? Right. In the US House of Representatives, we vote every 2 years, which is a lot, on our representatives. And you can see since the early 90s, this is what the trend has looked like. This data is actually from the National Election Pool exit poll, which is another election week survey of young people, which gathers information from people who voted early, people who voted from absentee, and from people directly outside of precincts. So as you can see, young people still were much more likely to vote for a Democratic House candidate, but that decreased from 2018 and from 2022. Okay, what else can we learn? There was a lot of conversation this year about gender. Unfortunately, I cannot report on young people who did not identify as who identify as non-binary or another gender because of sample sizes. I can say that young people who identify as non-binary voted very strongly for Vice President Harris. I think the number is 69%, if I'm not mistaken. You can find that on our website. But when we try to break this down a little bit further, we can't share the non-binary information. So what we see here is among young women, 18 to 29-year-olds, and young men in 2020 versus 2024. And one of the things to take away from this is the difference between young men and young women in 2024. Both groups were more likely to vote for a Republican candidate in 2024 than in 2020, but there's a pretty significant difference, right? 56% of young men in 2024 voted for Trump versus 40% of young women. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about race and ethnicity, and that's going to come into play a lot here when we dig even further into the data. So this is white youth specifically, or no, sorry. This is not white youth. This is youth by race and ethnicity, right? I just showed gender. I'm going to show race and ethnicity data, and then I'm going to show the combination. So the numbers on the bottom are the percentages from 2020. Same source, AP VoteCast survey. And then the donuts is the data from 2024. And you can see that in each of these racial and ethnic categories, young people were more likely to support a Republican candidate in 2024 compared to 2020. But that really differed by race. So white youth were more likely, as they have been for almost as long as I've been working on this, vote for a Republican candidate compared to a Democratic candidate, right? Whereas we see different variations of that with Black youth, Asian youth, and Latino youth. There's a lot of young people who aren't represented in these donuts, but again, we are not able to report on them reliably because of the sample size of the data that we have. So we saw that big differences by gender, big differences by race, which means that when we move to the data about race and gender, probably going to see some big differences. But before we do that, I just want to show some education data. Now, you can see here that young people without any college experience who have a high school diploma or less were more likely to vote for President-elect Trump compared to some of these other groups. But I want to caution that that can really differ by race and ethnicity, right? So we see some of these trends, but they don't hold in every single situation. And one of the things that we're also looking at, for example, is gender, race, and education, which I think I'll be able to show as well. We usually see these sorts of differences by urbanicity and rurality. However, I again want to caution that there are differences among this. We're about to release some rundown of data on Black youth, and Black youth in rural areas were incredibly supportive of Vice President Harris. Okay, so here we're finally getting to the data about gender and race. And just a quick takeaway on this is that there's some pretty big differences, right? Some huge differences. All of these numbers have margins of error and various levels of margins of error. But even with the margins of error, some of the differences are pretty huge. First off, just with the first two bars, we see that white women are split between the presidential candidates. Young white men, much less so. We see that in the next two bars, we see that Black youth were very supportive of Vice President Harris, but Black women more so than Black men. And then you can see other differences as we go down here. With each of the sort of pairs of bars, we definitely see that young men were more supportive of Trump than young women were in their respective racial and ethnic group. So here we get to some education data. Now, this is gender and education, not considering race, right? And as we can see here, both men with and without a college degree were more likely to support President-elect Trump. Now, men with a college degree, because that's probably going to be a very large group, um, but we still have a margin of error there, right? So that group is a little bit more split. But as we can see amongst women, young women, regardless of having a college degree, were in a different spot. Okay. Whew. Okay. So that was the vote choice data. There's a lot there, believe me. I'm not sharing all of it to bore all of you. But I also want to recognize that this is, some of the data is helpful, and also there's so much more that we can follow right now. And I'm wondering if people have some things that they want to share that, or some stories that you were really, jazzed by, or that you want to continue to follow to find out more about um, as we move forward. This list is a list of things that I'm thinking about post-election. Um, and everyone has posted about almost all of these things so far. But what else are people, kind of thinking about, really wanting to follow, or something that you really saw this year that you were excited about?
So
And
this, oh,
mhm.
just something interesting I saw two slides prior when we were looking at the voter data when it came down to race for youth vote. Um, it looked like when it came to white men that they had the smallest amount of third party votes compared to every other from what it looked like. And I think that's kind of interesting, especially when you start breaking down the data and seeing how people voted, not just with the two parties, but also where those votes went for the third parties and others. Obviously, there's no real third party in the US, but seeing what some people are thinking about and maybe trying to figure out if there may be a shift in people wanting to break away from this binary two-party system we have.
Interesting question. I will remind you of that all of these numbers are in the single digits, and there are
Yeah,
margins of error.
for sure. Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, but yeah, I mean that was a significant conversation this year, as it is often.
Yes.
Jeremy, I love this story of all the poll workers being students. How did that end up happening?
It was kind of a partnership with one of our professors who runs the public service learning community at our school. Um, he kind of did worked with the Board of Elections, and they did a on-campus poll worker training, and so we had a bunch of students through that community go and participate, and they get paid and stuff for it as well, so it was kind of a fun thing. But
Yeah,
yeah, it was just great to see. Our office kind of does some stuff outside of the poll site because we can't be in the poll site.
yep.
um, and just nonpartisan, kind of just getting students excited about voting. I wore a big old red, white, and blue hat, and kind of did some trivia. We did games and had a bunch of food. But yeah, get inside it was pretty cool to see the everyone that was passing out the ballots and whatnot, answering questions. They were all students, which was cool. And our person that was running the poll site was a grad student. So
No, that's amazing.
yeah.
Yeah, we have some limited research about young people that we did with young people in Minneapolis about the impact of being a poll worker, and that they reported, and it's phenomenal. It's truly phenomenal. And I think, um, if I recollect correctly, help people understand how elections work, right? Which can really be powerful. Okay, we have another example. A city-hosted in-person absentee voting site on campus with amazing numbers. That's phenomenal. I was on a campus last month where they, in Minnesota, actually, where they brought a drop-in early voting site, which is a new innovation they have in Minnesota, which was really exciting. Okay, so yeah, so these are some of the things that I'm kind of paying attention to and trying to understand about the election and the ways in which we can learn from what happened. And I like to talk about these other ways in which young people participate in elections for a few reasons. One is not all young people can vote, right? And to really think about inclusive democracy, we have to think about that. We also often get asked about what people can do if they're not yet 18 years old. Um, and so there are some amazing programs where young people who are 16, 17-year-olds can act as poll workers in Maryland. They can do things before that, which is cool. But there's so many things that young people and students can do if they're not eligible to vote. And I think that's really exciting. Okay. The last thing I want to return to this and kind of acknowledge some of the timelines that are on here. So one of the things that I want to point out is that we'll have state by state youth voter turnout in the winter and spring, and this is entirely dependent on when a state sort of gets all of the things certified and done with. In addition, in the spring, we'll have youth voter turnout by demographic groups, right? So we'll be able to say Black youth voted at X rate and, other things like that. And then I don't know if folks on this call are signed up for the National Study for Learning, Voting, and Engagement and NSOLVE project. But there's still time to participate if you want to go on the NSOLVE website and sign up. That timeline is much longer, right? Because not only do we need the state voter files to be done, but there has to be a matching process. And so the very, very earliest the campuses would get any information is late fall 2025. But that, is something that is, being discussed and everything. And so some of the websites that I mentioned are here: circle.tufts.edu, nsolve.tufts.edu. And you can feel free to reach out to us. We have a couple of other things coming up this fall. Additional analysis of sort of motivations, issues, vote choice amongst young people. We have a post up there about Latino youth, and my colleagues are working on posts about Black youth and Asian youth. We also have a post-election poll out there, which is really focused on understanding the types of access and support young people received or maybe didn't receive, to understand how we can further grow voters and build the infrastructure necessary for that. And then I talked about some of the other things. Okay. I'll pass it back over to you, Chuck. Thanks so much.
Can we all give Abby a virtual round of applause? I think this was very helpful, and I think it's very good to see the data. Also, is it possible to get a copy of those slides? Awesome.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to just hold space for a few minutes to open up if any campuses or see or campus vote staff just want to share anything that inspired them through November, things that they saw on their campus, or on the opposite side, if there are things that you're seeing that you're concerned about. So are there people who would like to speak up? I did put Caleb on the spot, but Caleb, if you can briefly talk about that campus that you spent time at.
Yeah, so I went up to Lehigh, and actually it was a little longer than a 5 hour wait. So, I actually had a chance to talk to a couple students while I was walking around giving out food and drinks, and They said so the way that the building worked was that you had to walk, the start of it was on the one side and you had to walk basically all the way around the building to get in the entrance. And there were people at that third quarter who had been waiting there for 7 hours and probably had another hour and a half till they actually got in the voting booth. And there were people around the other line of the building that were just getting there. And that was at like 4:30, I think 3:30, 4-ish. So yeah, that was kind of very disheartening to see how long those lines actually were and how long people are waiting there for.
Yeah, I want to put in the link just to save it for future elections. If you have never used Pizza to the Polls, I highly recommend it. If there are lines that are more than an hour, they will send pizza. I have never ordered so much pizza in my life, and it was fantastic. Um, but I don't think we should celebrate people having to wait for hours. I think we should honor people who didn't give up, but I think 7 hour lines, 5 hour lines, even two, is just unacceptable, especially when we see them at college campuses and other precincts, not necessarily. So it's definitely a fight ahead. Anyone else have anything they'd like to uplift, and then I will give a brief update. Awesome. Well, I do want to. Oh, Anthony.
Uh, this is some nice stuff I saw in other counties, not in ours. But the youngest supervisor of elections in Florida, it took him like 9 days to set up this like streaming process of like the election counts. So like you can see live like poll workers doing that on stream. And I think that like, I don't know how many people were tuning in, but it's just amazing how quickly he was able to do that. And at the same time, I think that it's very, very helpful for like post-Trump politics where like election denial is like this big thing and like this feeling of insecurity about the process. I think it was a nice show of goodwill and transparency. And then I think this like at this point I'm like I don't even know if this actually happened, right? Because like people are just telling me that no, that's just not a thing that people do anymore because there's not like a standardized process that like supervisor of elections go under in this case at least. But he also was saying like, well, personally at my office, and then he also feels like this is like some type of obligation that like if somebody were to like email him like a new voter registration form that was filled out, that like if it's during his hours, he feels that he should, that's like as a supervisor of elections, they have to process that. But and I mean we have all this technology now to like scan documents where I think in the past like the issue was like, well, you can't really like sign a PDF like the way that you would have to for some of these forms. But now that technology is out there, and I think it's really necessary, and we saw with like two hurricanes that hit us like back to back, there's a lot of people that could not make it to the post office while they were trying to evacuate. So I mean, it's like not the most uplifting thinking of it that way, but definitely that I think that I don't know. I think there's some hope that like, technology will eventually like, catch up to speed with like some of the issues here. Or I think that it already has. I just think there just needs to be more buy-in and more investment in setting things like this up quickly so that other people can get to the polls, or get their ballots out.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate your comments. So before we wrap this up, in terms of voter-friendly campus, this is the final webinar for 2024. If your campus is in the process of becoming a voter-friendly campus again, which you all should be, um, there is a final report that'll be due February 15th. We are unfortunately having some technical issues, but it should be on our website by Friday of this week. It's essentially a 5 question report where we ask campuses to reflect on, how the semester went, how their action plan, what worked, what could have been in, what you would want to change. And then there will be a series of basic questions such as contacts and all that. And then those will be due the 15th of February. And then in the following month, we'll announce our new set of voter-friendly campuses for 2024 to 2025. please feel free. You all should have it, but I'm gonna put my work email in the chat. If you have any questions about voter-friendly campus or just the campus vote project in general, please feel free to contact me. And if not, I appreciate you all coming on, and we will talk to all of you soon. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks again.